As of 18, you are allowed to make a will, although there are some exceptions for individuals who are in the armed forces. But anybody that's over the age of 18 is able to make a valid will. It's never too early. I suppose one could argue, as soon as you have any kind of assets that you would like to pass on, then if you make a will, then you're prepared and you're covered. It may be that you don't have anything of particularly significant value, and therefore you might not feel it's necessary to make a will, or indeed it may be that at such a young age you're quite comfortable with the intestacy rules kicking in, so perhaps your parents or siblings receiving something from your estate. But very often we would recommend that as soon as somebody has some kind of tangible property that they're looking to pass on, and they have ultimately any kind of significant wishes, it's sensible to put a will in place from that point on.
As soon as you've got assets which are sufficient enough in size to justify being dealt with by a will, then you should be looking at it. One thing that's often overlooked is that the intestacy rules, the way they work is, if an individual has no children and dies, then their parents will inherit their estate. Now, that breaks one of the first rules of inheritance tax planning, which is never ever leave assets upstairs, because there's just going to be more inheritance tax to pay when these older people die, presumably, well, maybe not long afterwards. So there's going to be a greater incidence of inheritance tax because the assets are passing through more estates. So in very simple terms, broadly speaking, as soon as you bought your first house or flat, get a will made and avoid breaking this first rule.
Solicitors and sort of formally trained legal representatives who tend to have been to law school of some kind tend to give a wider spectrum of advice. So people do come in to talk about their wills, but sometimes that can encompass discussions about family law, perhaps if they're divorced, or if they've got a what we call a common law partner, somebody that they live with as if they were husband and wife. If they've got estranged children, those kinds of things need to be taken into consideration when drafting a will. And you've also got slightly more commercial aspects, perhaps if you've got multiple properties or a business, or if you've got some kind of agricultural land or assets that need to be considered. These are all things that a legal professional should be able to advise you on, or at least point you in the right direction as to where the advice can be sought. Whereas looking at these wills that we were speaking about before, you know, these do-it-yourself wills from the rack or whatever the case may be, sometimes those things just aren't taken into consideration simply because people don't realise that they need to be taken into consideration. So that's another benefit of working with a lawyer or with a firm of solicitors.
Thing which comes up quite a lot nowadays as people live longer, we deal a lot more with what you might call blended families, second marriages, and children from often adult children from two separate marriages, and how you balance the expectation of the children of the first spouse to die, who might be thinking, well, I was expecting to inherit after my father died, mum died some years ago, he's remarried now, his second wife is perhaps a little bit younger than him, she's got children of her own. How do you balance the expectation of the children of the first spouse to die against the expectation of his second spouse, who wants to be supported for the remainder of her life? And how do you make a will which doesn't leave open the door to the possibility of the second wife leaving everything to her own children? And if you do leave that door open, there's a possibility of some damaging and expensive litigation further down the line. So having someone who really knows how to draft wills which balance these expectations and leave the door shut for these sort of unwelcome outcomes is really important.